For most of his life, Professor Elias Rowan believed he understood the prophetic roadmap of Scripture. He had read the books, taught university-level courses on the Old Testament, and debated scholars who built entire careers around decoding Revelation. He had walked the streets of New York and heard preachers declare that the fall of Manhattan would signal the end. He had stood in Rome and listened to tour guides whisper about secret Vatican corridors and the ancient harlot on 7 hills. He had even heard a billionaire in Dubai boast that his city would one day rise as the world's new Babylon. Everywhere Elias went, he found people saying the same thing in different accents. Watch Babylon. When Babylon collapses, the Antichrist has come. It was strange how confident people were, how convinced the entire world seemed that one catastrophic moment, one fiery downfall, would serve as the global alarm bell announcing the darkest chapter of human history. Yet, something about this near-universal assumption began to trouble him in a way he could not explain. Maybe it was intuition, maybe a whisper from the spirit, maybe a sense that the world had grown too fixated on the wrong symbol. Or maybe it was the memory of a former student named Marissa, who once asked him why everyone looked at the loud passages in Revelation but ignored the quiet ones. Because loud things are easier to fear, Elias had answered her. He didn't realize at the time how prophetic that statement was. Years later, when he finally revisited the text without the noise of popular prophecy culture, he saw something startling. Babylon's fall in Revelation 18 was indeed spectacular smoke rising, kings weeping from a distance, merchants mourning over lost wealth. The imagery was cinematic, terrifying, unforgettable, but it came with a detail most people overlooked: the timing. Babylon fell in 1 hour, quick, final, near the end. But long before that, something else happened. Something quieter in the text, yet louder in consequence. Something that Jesus himself mentioned directly. And the more Professor Rowan studied it, the more he realized millions of believers had been staring at the wrong city. It wasn't Babylon that fell first. It was a different place, entirely one with spiritual gravity far stronger than any financial capital or political hub. A place whose history had shaped empires and ignited wars. A place whose skyline had witnessed tears of prophets, the coronation of kings, the rise and fall of conquerors. A place where the divine and human collided in a way no other city on earth could claim. But before Elias arrived at that revelation, he wanted to understand why Babylon had so thoroughly captured the world's imagination. So he traveled the world in search of why humanity had equated one ancient name with the ultimate signal of doom. He went first to London, wandering through the British Museum, where artifacts from ancient Mesopotamia filled glass cases. He watched tourists marvel at the Ishtar Gate replicas, taking selfies near blue brick lions. Their fascination was almost instinctive, as if the word Babylon carried a mysterious weight even for people who had never opened a Bible. He sat in the museum cafe, listening to two strangers debate whether a modern financial hub could truly qualify as Babylon the Great. One argued passionately that global trade defined the modern world, so the final Babylon must be wherever wealth flows fastest. The other insisted Babylon must be Rome. After all, tradition mattered, and prophecy always circles back to old roots. Elias wrote these conversations in his journal, noting the pattern. People weren't studying scripture, they were projecting fears: fear of economic collapse, fear of institutional corruption, fear of modernity spiraling out of control. Babylon had become a canvas onto which the world painted its anxieties, and Revelation 18, with its imagery of a burning superpower crumbling in 60 minutes, offered the perfect stage for those fears. Next, he traveled to New York, standing at the edge of the Hudson River while a local street preacher shouted that the skyscrapers around them would one day melt like wax. The man waved a weathered King James Bible overhead and warned passers-by that investment bankers were modern merchants of Babylon. Some people laughed and recorded him on their phones. Others walked by faster, avoiding eye contact. But Elias simply watched, taking in the intensity of the man's conviction. Afterward, over a bowl of Manhattan clam chowder at a small diner in the East Village, Professor Rowan reflected on how deeply the idea of Babylon had embedded itself into culture. Not just Christian culture, global culture. Babylon was everywhere, in songs, in movies, in literature, in political commentary. It had become shorthand for collapse, an icon of downfall so powerful that the world couldn't imagine anything else taking center stage. But the more he studied scripture, the more he realized something important. The loudest symbol wasn't always the first sign. In Chicago, while visiting his sister, he lectured at a local seminary. During the Q&A session, a young woman raised her hand and asked, "Professor Rowan, if Babylon doesn't fall first, then what is the warning sign? What should believers watch for?" It was the question he feared and the question he knew he couldn't yet answer publicly. Not until he gathered the full picture. So he gave her the standard scholarly response. Prophecy should make us alert but not anxious. Sometimes what we assume is the first event is actually the last. But she pressed again. "So Babylon isn't the first." Elias hesitated, then said gently, "Babylon falls quickly, and much later than most people think. Scripture makes that clear, but the first city to fall is one Jesus talked about, not John." It was an honest answer, but incomplete. He knew he needed more time, more prayer, more clarity, and so his journey continued, taking him next to Dubai, a city glittering with wealth and ambition. Here, the myth of modern Babylon was alive in every conversation. Construction cranes dotted the horizon, supercars roared down the highway, luxury malls looked like palaces. Elias met with a local Christian worker who told him that every visiting prophecy group insisted Dubai must be the final Babylon. "It looks the part," the man joked. "Gold, jewels, power. But prophecy isn't about appearances." Elias nodded. He already knew that. Revelation 18's Babylon wasn't just about wealth. It was about timing, judgment, and the collapse of a global system. And Revelation 18's description didn't match the beginning of the tribulation, it matched the final moments. As his plane left Dubai, Elias finally understood something crucial. The entire world was staring at Babylon because Babylon was dramatic. But Scripture didn't teach believers to watch for drama. It taught them to watch for obedience, for patterns, for the words Jesus personally emphasized. He returned home to California, feeling a strange mixture of relief and urgency. Relief because he finally saw the error, urgency because the world didn't. Babylon may be the city of spectacle, but the first city to fall was the city of significance. It was there, sitting at his oak desk with a warm lamp glowing beside a stack of open Bibles, that Professor Rowan finally traced the line between prophecy and history. He found himself flipping through Matthew 24, reading words he had read hundreds of times but never fully connected to the end-time sequence. "When you see the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place," he whispered those words out loud. Standing in the holy place. That was the moment everything clicked. Babylon wasn't the city Jesus warned people to flee. Babylon wasn't the city where the Great Tribulation began. Babylon wasn't the city where the Antichrist declared himself God. Babylon wasn't even mentioned by Jesus at all. The first city to fall was somewhere else entirely, somewhere that carried divine weight, historical scars, and spiritual gravity unmatched by any other place on earth. A city Jesus saw from the Mount of Olives, a city he wept over, a city he died near, a city he will return to, a city that has shaped the destiny of nations for more than 3 millennia. And yet, the world wasn't watching it. They were watching Babylon, the wrong city, the loud city, the dramatic city, but not the first city, not the city Jesus named. As Elias closed his Bible and rested his hand against the worn leather cover, he spoke into the quiet of his study. "They're not ready. They're watching the wrong place." His words echoed softly, almost as if someone or something was listening. And in that moment he knew, if he wanted to prepare the world, he needed to take them back to the mountain where Jesus first spoke the warning, back to the moment when prophecy and geography collided, back to the quiet instruction that carried the weight of life and death. To understand the first city to fall, the world needed to hear Jesus again, not through tradition, not through speculation, not through sensational predictions, but through the simple clarity of his words. And that journey would begin on a mountain. Professor Elias Rowan had always imagined what it would have been like to stand beside Jesus on that legendary slope overlooking the city. But imagination was never enough, not for a man obsessed with accuracy. So when he finally returned to Israel after years of teaching, he set out to climb a different ridge than the one tourists were used to. He avoided the crowded observation decks and instead walked a narrow footpath that skirted the quiet side of Mount Herzl, a hill overlooking modern Jerusalem with a view that, at dawn, glowed like a golden river of stone. It wasn't the Mount of Olives. He didn't want to recreate the exact geography. What he wanted was the emotion of the moment, the weight of the air, the silence before revelation, the subtle tension when truth pierces through the ordinary. And on Mount Herzl, as the wind rustled through the pine trees and the first rays of sun washed over the tiled rooftops below, Elias felt the ancient story come alive in a way no commentary had ever offered him. He sat alone on a wooden bench near a memorial garden, watching the city wake. Cars hummed in the distance. A few early joggers moved along the trail. Birds hopped between branches, singing as if unaware of the centuries of conflict that had shaped every stone of the land beneath them. Elias opened a small leather notebook, the same notebook that traveled with him across London, New York, Chicago, and Dubai. He wrote a single line at the top of a fresh page. When Jesus warned of the abomination, he was looking at a real city. It struck him how often modern Christians treated prophecy as metaphor, as if the events were vague symbols floating in an undefined space. Yet Jesus didn't speak vaguely. He didn't offer abstract poetry or illustrate his warnings with philosophical riddles. He spoke plainly, pointing to a region his disciples understood, a place with physical coordinates, homes, markets, alleys, families, a place people lived in, a place people fled from, a place where survival depended on movement, not meditation. Elias imagined the disciples seated around Jesus, not the Renaissance version with painted robes and haloed faces, but real fishermen with calloused hands, dusty feet, and confusion in their eyes, men who could smell the bread vendors down below, who knew the curves of the stone streets, who recognized the glint of sunlight reflecting off the temple's outer walls, men whose entire world fit within that valley. He saw Jesus lift his hand, not dramatically, but with steady certainty toward the city, and he heard, as if the first-century voice still vibrated in the modern air, "When you see the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place, then those in the region must flee into the mountains." Elias whispered the words to himself. The wind carried them outward, scattering them like seeds. The holy place. It wasn't Babylon. It wasn't Rome. It wasn't Alexandria. Athens, or Damascus. It wasn't a coastal city or a desert kingdom or a modern metropolis sparkling with steel and glass. It was here, in this region, this land, this slope where prophecy intersected sight. The disciples didn't ask, "Where is the holy place?" They already knew. No one needed directions. No one needed clarification. Jesus wasn't describing a symbol, he was identifying a location. The realization hit Elias with a force that startled him. Jesus didn't point to the city that would fall last. He pointed to the city that would fall first. He reached for his notebook again, writing quickly as if the words might run away before he captured them. The warning was geographical, not theoretical. A young Israeli soldier walked past him on patrol, nodding politely. The sight triggered something deeper in Elias, a thought he had not considered before. Modern Israel lived with a sense of alertness most nations could not understand. Sirens were normal, shelters were familiar, drills were routine. The urgency Jesus described, run, don't turn back, don't gather belongings, don't hesitate. This land knew what urgency felt like. It had lived it for decades. Sudden danger wasn't foreign here, and that made Jesus' warning feel even sharper. Elias stood, leaving the bench behind, and began walking down the hill toward a series of stone steps that descended into a quiet neighborhood. As he walked, he tried to imagine what it would feel like to hear that prophecy in real time. If you're on your rooftop when you see it happen, don't go into the house, just go. If you're in the field, don't run back to grab your coat, just flee. If you're pregnant or nursing, pray for strength because you'll be vulnerable. Pray it doesn't happen in winter. Pray it doesn't happen on a Sabbath when the city slows down. Why would Jesus speak like that unless the danger was immediate, physical, and unavoidable? He reached the bottom of the stairs where an elderly man watered flowers outside his small store. Elias greeted him in Hebrew, and the man smiled, gesturing to a row of potted lavender. "Beautiful morning, isn't it?" he said. Elias nodded. "Beautiful and sobering." The man tilted his head. "Sobering? I've been thinking about history," Elias replied. "About warnings that people didn't take seriously." The old man chuckled softly. "In this city, history is not just something you study. It sits beside you while you drink your coffee. It follows you on your walk home. It whispers to you from every stone." Elias appreciated the poetry of the moment. "And do you think people today listen to the whispers?" "Some do," the man answered. "Others choose the noise. The noise. The noise of Babylon. The noise of global speculation. The noise of sensational prophecy charts. The noise of YouTube preachers pointing at stock markets instead of scripture." The old man returned to his flowers, and Elias continued walking, replaying the conversation in his mind. People choose the noise because noise is easier to follow. It feels urgent, it feels dramatic. But Jesus' warning wasn't noisy. It wasn't theatrical. It was calm, clear, and deeply geographical. Flee when you see it happen. Immediately, no hesitation, because the danger is here. Elias turned down a street lined with cafes where early workers gathered for coffee. Laughter drifted from a table where two women chatted animatedly about weekend plans. A group of backpackers checked their maps. A young musician tuned a guitar near a bus stop. This was life vibrant, ordinary life. And yet, Jesus had spoken a warning into a scene very much like this. The inflection of his words carried both compassion and urgency. Not panic, not fear-mongering, compassion, a desire that his followers would survive what was coming. As Elias walked, he thought about the modern obsession with dramatic prophecy. People often gravitate toward the spectacular fire falling, cities burning, towers collapsing. But Jesus didn't start his warning with spectacle. He started with a location, and he started with a command designed to save lives, not frighten them. It made Elias rethink everything he thought he knew about prophecy. He stopped at a cafe near a stone wall and ordered tea. Sitting at a small table facing the street, he took out his notebook again and wrote a new sentence. Jesus didn't tell the world to watch Babylon. He told the believers in this region to flee. He underlined the word flee, then he underlined it again. This wasn't metaphorical language. This wasn't symbolic imagery. This was survival instruction. Imagine hearing those words as a young mother rocking her baby to sleep. Imagine hearing them as an elderly man returning from the marketplace. Imagine hearing them as a teenager running errands, unaware of the coming storm. Elias imagined himself standing beside a family who heard that message for the first time. How would they react? Would they shrug it off? Would they chalk it up to another rabbi using dramatic warnings to gain attention? Would they quietly believe and prepare? Would they hold the teaching close to their hearts, hoping they would never see the day Jesus described? As he drank his tea, Elias watched the city with new eyes. Every building, every rooftop, every narrow alleyway, every crowded bus stop. The urgency of Jesus' words infused everything with a sense of fragile impermanence. Then he remembered something important. Jesus' warning wasn't just about geography or timing, it was also about identity. The abomination of desolation wasn't simply an event, it revealed who the Antichrist truly was. Only one figure in history would dare enter the temple, stand where only the holy was meant to be, and declare himself divine. Only one would demand global worship. Only one would break a covenant with ruthless precision. And Jesus knew his followers needed to recognize that moment instantly. Not after analysis, not after debate, not after sermons. Instantly. That meant the first city to fall had to be one where the Antichrist could perform a specific act, a desecration that Scripture had warned about for centuries. It couldn't be New York, it couldn't be Rome, it couldn't be Dubai or Singapore or Hong Kong or any other modern center of wealth. It had to be the region surrounding the holy place. It had to be a city whose spiritual history ran back through Abraham, David, Solomon, Hezekiah, Zerubbabel, the Maccabees, Jesus himself, the city Jesus wept over, the city God claimed as his own, the city that shaped the destiny of nations, the first city to fall. As he finished his tea, Elias felt the weight of that truth settle into his bones. It was no longer a scholarly observation, it was a personal responsibility. If the world continued to focus on the wrong sign, millions would be spiritually unprepared for the moment that mattered most. He placed a few shekels on the table, closed his notebook, and stood. The morning had turned brighter. The streets were filling with life. The smell of freshly baked bread drifted from a nearby bakery. A child laughed as her father lifted her onto his shoulders. All around him, life moved forward. But beneath the rhythm of daily life, Elias heard a different rhythm, the echo of a prophecy spoken on a mountain long ago. A prophecy that began not with Babylon, but with a place far more sacred. A prophecy delivered not with panic, but with clarity. A prophecy that, once understood, would change everything he believed about the future. He took a deep breath. The world wasn't ready for the truth, but he was. And it was time to follow Jesus' words deeper into the reason why the Antichrist would choose this city above all others, into the spiritual gravity that made this land the center of heaven's story and hell's ambition. Elias walked down the street, notebook in hand, heart steady with purpose. The journey wasn't about speculation anymore. It was about revelation. Elias Rowan didn't leave Israel right away. Something pulled him back into the city, an invisible current of spiritual weight that made him feel as though walking away too quickly would be a betrayal of the revelation he had just begun to understand. He spent 3 more days wandering through neighborhoods surrounding the ancient ridge known today as the City of David, but instead of focusing on archaeology or historical monuments, he found himself drawn to people, faces, voices, lives unfolding in a place that had been fought over more than any other city in human history. He stood one afternoon on a narrow street paved with cobblestones, polished by centuries of footsteps. Children ran past him, chasing a soccer ball, their laughter echoing between the stone walls. An elderly man, hunched with age, carried groceries in a canvas bag. A young couple walked hand in hand, whispering softly to each other in Hebrew. Life persisted here, defiant, fragile, beautiful. But beneath the surface was something else, something ancient, something the world rarely saw because it wasn't carved into monuments or written on plaques. It was woven into the soil itself, into the breath of the land, a spiritual gravity so strong that even empires couldn't escape its pull. Elias knew the birthplace of this gravity was God's choice. The moment God said, "This is my city," everything changed. The very identity of the land shifted. It became more than real estate, more than history, more than conflict. It became destiny, and destiny attracts opposition. As Elias walked toward the entrance of a small museum built near the excavated ruins of an ancient palace, he thought of a passage he had read years earlier, one that described Jerusalem as the spiritual center of the universe in Jewish teaching, the place where heaven and earth touched. Ancient rabbis called it the navel of the world, meaning everything radiated from it, every blessing, every battle, every promise, every prophecy. Standing at the museum entrance, Elias whispered to himself, "No wonder the Antichrist wants this place first." A guide approached him, a woman in her early 30s with dark curly hair and warm eyes. She greeted him with a professional smile. "Would you like a tour? We're covering new archaeological findings today." "Please," he replied, as she led him through the exhibit, pointing out fragments of pottery, inscriptions, and architectural remnants. Elias found himself less captivated by the artifacts and more by the stories behind her words, the cycles of conquest, devastation, rebuilding, and rebirth. Every time an empire thought it had claimed the city permanently, the city outlived it. Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome, Byzantium, Ottoman rule, British mandate, and modern wars from 1948 to now, the city survived them all. When they reached a balcony overlooking a deep excavation site, the guide paused. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "people around the world wonder why this city has been fought over so fiercely for so long. But if you live here, you don't wonder, you feel it." Elias turned to her. "Feel what?" "That this place matters, spiritually, emotionally, historically. It matters in a way you can't explain with logic." She shrugged gently. "People don't fight over places they don't care about." Her words echoed something Elias had been writing in his notebook for months. Satan attacks what God treasures. He leaned on the railing and looked down at the ruins. The stones below were fractured, worn, chipped by time and conflict, but they were still here, still standing, still defying the empires that once trampled them. And that resilience meant something far deeper than survival. It reflected divine purpose. He imagined the moment when the Antichrist, the final enemy, would walk into the restored temple standing somewhere near this ridge. The symbolism alone would be an act of cosmic arrogance. The seat of God occupied by his greatest enemy, a throne of holiness claimed by the embodiment of deception, a city chosen by God, commandeered by the one who wished to replace him. It would be Satan's ultimate imitation, his counterfeit coronation, his moment to declare, "I can sit where you sit." Elias scribbled into his notebook again, "The Antichrist doesn't choose the city because of politics. He chooses it because of power, divine power." He closed the notebook and followed the guide back toward the exit. When he stepped outside, sunlight spilled across the street like molten gold. A group of teenagers were gathered around a street vendor buying pomegranate juice, their laughter bright and carefree. A soldier leaned against a wall checking his phone. A woman wearing a colorful scarf hurried past carrying a basket of vegetables. Life in this city always found a way to flourish, even in the shadow of its prophetic destiny. As Elias walked down the street, he wondered what it would feel like when the covenant, the one Daniel wrote about, was finally broken. The world would likely celebrate the first 3.5 years of the Antichrist's rule, peace agreements, diplomatic triumphs, international cooperation. People would think he was the greatest leader the world had ever known, but on day 1,260, everything would change. The Antichrist would enter the temple. He would stop the sacrifices. He would exalt himself as God. He would place an image where no image was ever meant to stand. And from that moment on, this city, this living, breathing tapestry of ancient destiny would fall under his occupation, not by destruction, but by desecration. Elias wasn't prepared for how deeply the thought affected him. It wasn't just academic anymore, it felt personal. He felt protective over the children laughing in the street, the elderly man tending his store, the mothers pushing strollers, the young soldiers guarding the checkpoints. This wasn't some theoretical location on a prophecy chart. This was a city full of families, grandparents, students, artists, workers, believers, skeptics, real people. And they were the first who would face the darkness of the Antichrist's reign. He found himself wandering into a small bookstore tucked between two cafes. Inside, the air smelled like warm paper and cedar. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling. Elias took a seat near the back, where a stack of historical texts sat waiting to be explored. But instead of opening them, he closed his eyes. The city mattered because God said it mattered. And the more he reflected on that fact, the more he understood why Satan had always been obsessed with conquering it. The first rebellion in heaven had been about the throne. Satan wanted it. He didn't want to be separate from God. He wanted to be like God, to sit where God sat, to rule what God ruled. And since the earthly reflection of God's throne was the temple, the holy place, the Antichrist's occupation would be the physical manifestation of Satan's ancient desire. Elias breathed in deeply. "This is the I Will spirit," he whispered. "The same I Will that destroyed Eden. The same I Will that corrupted nations. The same I Will that inspired every tyrant in history." He knew now why the Antichrist didn't choose Rome or New York or any other city. Those cities were powerful, but they were not chosen. They were influential, but they were not sacred. They were important, but they were not divine. This city, this ancient ridge overlooking valley and stone, was where God had placed his name. It was where Abraham offered Isaac, where David built his fortress, where Solomon erected the first temple, where prophets wept and kings bowed, where Jesus walked, taught, prayed, and bled, where resurrection power broke the chains of the grave. The Antichrist wanted all of that, not the buildings, not the markets, not the real estate. He wanted the meaning. He wanted the symbol. He wanted the spiritual throne. As Elias sat in the bookstore, a soft melody played from the radio behind the counter, a Hebrew song about longing, about hope, about returning home. The lyrics felt like prophecy in their own way. Every generation of this land had waited for something: deliverance, peace, Messiah, restoration. And one day they would see all those things fulfilled, but not before the storm. Elias opened his notebook again and drew a timeline. Day 1, the covenant begins. Day 1260, the Antichrist breaks it. Next 42 months, this city falls. Final day, Christ returns. It was clear now. Simple, beautiful in its clarity, terrifying in its reality. He closed the notebook slowly. Everything Satan had ever wanted from the moment he rebelled was to sit in the one place God had chosen as his earthly throne. And the Antichrist would execute that desire with surgical precision. This wasn't merely conquest. It was defiance. It was blasphemy. It was imitation. It was revenge. He stood and walked to the door, the bell chiming softly as he stepped outside. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent, painting the sky with shades of gold and rose. The call of a vendor selling roasted nuts drifted through the air. A bus rumbled down the street. Somewhere in the distance, a shofar sounded deep, ancient, resonant. The city breathed, and Elias felt himself breathe with it, aware now more than ever that everything he had learned was leading to a single truth. The Antichrist didn't choose the first city by accident. He chose it because from the very beginning of creation, Satan had wanted to take what belonged to God. He headed toward his hotel, his mind racing not with fear, but with purpose. If the world was watching Babylon, someone had to redirect their gaze. Someone had to show them the truth hidden in plain sight. Someone had to remind them that Jesus had spoken clearly, lovingly, urgently. And Elias knew that someone was him. He tightened his grip on his notebook and walked into the fading light of evening. The city behind him hummed with life, but its destiny, a destiny written long before empires rose and fell, was calling him forward. Professor Elias Rowan flew back to the United States with the weight of Israel still clinging to him like desert dust that refuses to be shaken off. He landed in Washington, D.C., a city of marble monuments and political power, yet compared to the ancient ridge he had just left behind, it felt strangely hollow. Here, power existed in documents, speeches, and alliances. There, it existed in destiny. And yet, Washington was the perfect place to begin the next phase of his research, because if Jerusalem represented spiritual authority, then Babylon, whatever form it finally took, represented something equally important: systems, networks, global mechanisms that stitched nations together. And Elias knew he needed to understand why the Antichrist would allow Babylon to flourish even while occupying the first fallen city. His first meeting was with an old friend, Dr. Preston Hale, a soft-spoken economist who had once advised several world governments on trade policy. Preston welcomed Elias into his townhouse lined with books on global economics, international law, and, somewhat surprisingly, theology. They sat near a window overlooking the quiet Georgetown street as evening settled in. "You look troubled," Preston said, pouring tea into porcelain cups. Elias didn't soften his expression. "I've been in Jerusalem." "Ah." Preston sat back. "That city has a way of opening the sky and showing you what's underneath it." Elias nodded. "I realized something. The world is watching the wrong city. Babylon doesn't fall first, but Babylon still matters." "Of course it does," Preston said. Babylon represents the global infrastructure, the system that keeps the world functioning. And when Revelation says it collapses in 1 hour, that implies something very specific. Instant economic implosion, Elias said. Exactly. No war destroys a city in 1 hour, but a system? A system collapses the moment its foundation is removed. And who removes it? Elias asked. Preston's eyes sharpened. The beast, or rather, the global coalition under him. Babylon's usefulness ends, so they set it on fire. Elias leaned forward. So why doesn't the Antichrist destroy Babylon immediately? Why not occupy it like he occupies Jerusalem? Because Jerusalem is symbolic, Preston replied. Spiritual, it legitimizes his false divinity. But Babylon? He tapped a book beside him. Babylon is practical. The words settled between them like iron. Practical. The Antichrist didn't just want worship. He wanted control. Total control. And you don't achieve total control by burning the system that feeds the world. At least not at the beginning, Preston continued. Global commerce, digital currency, international banking, trade distribution networks, none of these revolve around Jerusalem. They revolve around financial capitals: New York, London, Hong Kong, Tokyo, Frankfurt, Singapore, cities where money moves faster than ideas. And the mark of the beast requires functioning commerce, Elias whispered. Yes, Preston said. You can't restrict buying and selling if there is no buying and selling left. The Antichrist needs Babylon operational. He needs the world hooked into a system he can manipulate. Babylon isn't just a city, it's a network, and that network must remain intact until he's ready to collapse it. Elias felt a ripple of understanding. So Babylon is the last domino, not the first. Correct, Preston said. Jerusalem falls first because that's where he enthrones himself. Babylon falls last because that's where his power collapses. Elias sipped his tea, the flavor grounding him, even as his thoughts continued to ascend into the prophetic. He had spent so long trying to reconcile the symbolism and literalness of Revelation that he had forgotten something essential. Timing reveals intention. Eventually, Preston pulled a small leather-bound journal off a shelf and handed it to Elias. Inside were diagrams of global banking networks, maps of trade routes, and handwritten notes merging economic data with prophetic timelines. You can borrow this, Preston said, but be warned. Once you start seeing Babylon as a system instead of a city, you won't be able to unsee it. Elias held the journal reverently. Thank you. Just promise me one thing, Preston said with a faint smile. Don't tell anyone I'm the economist who helped a prophecy professor decode Revelation. Elias laughed softly. Your secret is safe with me. The next few weeks took him across the United States. He lectured in Boston, where students debated the morality of globalism. He visited Wall Street in New York, where financial analysts spoke casually of markets capable of crashing the world economy with a few keystrokes. He stood in Times Square at night, surrounded by neon lights and screens, advertising everything from beauty products to cryptocurrency, and thought of Revelation's merchants weeping as Babylon burned. He went to Chicago and met with a military strategist who explained how modern warfare could neutralize cities without firing a single missile. Collapse the economy, she said. The city falls. He traveled to Los Angeles and interviewed a filmmaker obsessed with apocalyptic imagery. People don't fear war anymore, the director told him. They fear systems breaking. Elias took notes everywhere he went, filling page after page with insights, parallels, warnings, and emotional reflections. But one conversation stood out above the rest. In Atlanta, he met a survivor of the 2008 financial crisis, a woman named Caroline, whose family had lost everything in the housing collapse. They sat across from each other at a cafe inside the bustling airport terminal. Her voice was quiet but steady. "When the system falls," she said, "you don't hear explosions, you hear silence. Phones stop ringing, banks freeze, people panic inside their own homes, and you realize how fragile the world really is." Elias listened carefully. "It feels like the ground disappears," Caroline continued. "You look outside, and the buildings are still standing, but your world is gone." Her words pierced him. Babylon didn't need to crumble physically for people to feel destroyed. A financial system could collapse without a single stone moved out of place. A digital network could malfunction and bring the world to its knees. A cyber attack could silence global commerce in seconds. He wrote one sentence after that meeting: "Babylon falls in 1 hour because modern systems fall in 1 hour." But if that was the case, then the contrast between the first fallen city and the last became even sharper. The first city falls by desecration. The last city falls by destruction. The first falls slowly occupied for 42 months. The last falls instantly in 1 hour. The first is about identity. The last is about economy. The first affects the faithful. The last affects the world. Elias knew he needed more than academic input. He needed human perspective. So he interviewed ordinary people: cab drivers, teachers, nurses, retired police officers, single mothers, pastors, construction workers. He asked them one simple question: if you had to run, if your city was suddenly unsafe, what would you do? Their answers varied, but each one revealed a piece of the emotional mosaic. A teacher in Denver said, "I'd grab my child, everything else can burn." A firefighter in Dallas said, "People underestimate panic. Panic kills faster than fire." A waitress in Nashville said, "I'd freeze. I know I would, and that scares me." A veteran in Phoenix said, "If you don't move immediately, you don't move at all." A grandmother in Miami said, "I'd pray for strength. My legs aren't what they used to be." And a teenage boy in Seattle said, "I don't know. I guess I'd just follow the crowd." Elias realized Jesus wasn't exaggerating. The call to flee wasn't dramatic imagery, it was essential survival instruction. When a city falls slowly, people suffer. When a city falls instantly, people mourn. Both kinds of collapse create trauma, but only one offers a window of escape. Jerusalem collapses by occupation. Babylon collapses by obliteration. And the world confuses the two. One evening, while sitting in his hotel room overlooking the Chicago River, Elias thought about how to communicate this revelation to the world. How do you explain to millions of believers that the first city to fall won't be the one they've been obsessively watching? How do you redirect global attention without causing fear? How do you bring clarity instead of chaos? He remembered the soldier he had seen in Jerusalem, the elderly man watering flowers, the laughter of children running through the streets, the pomegranate juice stand, the bookstore melody, the soft chime of a bell, the whisper of prophecy lingering in the air. He remembered the weight of Jesus' words spoken on a mountain 2,000 years ago, words meant to guide, protect, and warn, words ignored by generations who preferred the noise of Babylon to the clarity of Christ. Then he remembered something Preston had said in Washington: "People don't fear war, they fear systems breaking." Elias wrote the words at the top of a fresh notebook page, but beneath it, he added something deeper. People don't watch the city God named, they watch the city the world fears. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply, feeling the truth settle into him like a seed ready to sprout. He had reconstructed the entire prophetic framework in his mind. The first fallen city is chosen for spiritual reasons. The last fallen city is destroyed for economic reasons. The Antichrist doesn't occupy Babylon because he doesn't need to. He occupies Jerusalem because he desperately needs to. Babylon empowers him. Jerusalem crowns him. Babylon supports his system. Jerusalem legitimizes his claim. Babylon burns because its purpose ends. Jerusalem rises because its purpose begins anew. And when he finally opened his eyes, Elias felt something inside him shift. He was no longer just a professor, no longer just a researcher, no longer a traveler gathering fragmented insights. He was a messenger, a witness to a truth the world had forgotten. He stood by the window as the city lights shimmered across the water, and he whispered into the night, "People need to know why the first city falls, because when they understand that, they will understand everything else about the end." The river outside moved like a living stream, reflecting the glow of the city above it. And in that reflection, Elias saw the beginning of a restoration story. He had yet to write a story about a city that would rise higher than every collapse. He knew where the final part of his journey would lead him, to the moment after the fall, to the moment the king returns, to the moment the first fallen city becomes the eternal city. He turned off the lights, letting the darkness settle gently around him. Tomorrow, he would write about hope. Night had settled over Chicago when Professor Elias Rowan finally placed the last of his notes beside him. The room felt still, too still for a man whose mind had been racing for weeks. The outlines were complete. The revelations were clear. The pieces of prophecy, history, geography, economics, and spiritual warfare had all fallen into place, but something remained unfinished, lingering like the final echo of a symphony waiting for resolution. Hope, not optimism, not naive calm. Hope rooted in the certainty of prophecy fulfilled, of promises untouched by the rise and fall of nations. Hope in the one who had spoken long before the foundations of the world were laid. Elias stood at the window again, watching the glow of the city in the distance. Streams of cars moved across the highways like lines of light. Buildings rose like watchtowers. Life went on. People laughed, dreamed, fought, loved unaware of the cosmic storm Scripture foretold. Yet Elias didn't feel despair. Not tonight. Tonight, he felt something else. A quiet assurance that the ultimate story of the first fallen city was not tragedy, it was transformation. Months passed before Elias returned to Israel. The moment his plane touched the ground, the familiar scent of dust and warm air greeted him like an embrace. He rented a small room near the old city, not for tourism, but for meditation. He needed to stand once more on the ridge that overlooked the city whose destiny had shaped not only prophecy, but his own understanding of God's unstoppable plan. The morning he revisited Mount Herzl, the sky was pale gold. The breeze felt gentler than before, as if the land itself sensed that this journey would end in restoration. Elias carried no notebook, no research, no pen, only a heart ready to witness what Scripture promised would one day unfold. He walked slowly up the path, listening to the rustle of trees and the soft murmur of voices carried from distant streets. When he reached the same bench he had sat on before, he paused. The city below shimmered beneath the morning sun. For a long moment, he simply breathed, letting the weight of the land settle into him. Then he closed his eyes and imagined the moment Scripture described with such careful detail. The sky darkens. Armies gather like storm clouds. The beast sits enthroned in the desecrated temple. The world trembles beneath tyranny. The people of the city cry out for deliverance. But then something else happens. A sound. Not thunder. Not war. Not chaos. a tear in the sky. The heavens open like a scroll being unrolled, and light, not sunlight, but divine, radiant, consuming light pours down onto the Mount of Olives. The entire world sees it, every nation, every city, every screen, every eye. The king returns, not as a lamb, not as a teacher, not as a wandering rabbi, but as a warrior, as a lion, as the true ruler of heaven and earth. Elias could almost feel the mountain tremble beneath Christ's returning feet. Scripture said the moment his feet touched the ridge east of the city, the mountain would split in two, forming a valley of escape, a divine corridor carved not by human hands, but by the presence of the one whose voice called creation into existence. Elias opened his eyes slowly, blinking back the warmth gathering behind them. He looked at the city again, but now he didn't see the marketplace bustle, or the rooftops, or the ancient stones. He saw what would replace centuries of turmoil, prophecy, conflict, and longing. Restoration. Christ would march into the city not as a rebel chased by soldiers, not as a prisoner carrying a cross, but as the rightful king reclaiming what had always belonged to him. The desecrated temple would crumble, the throne of the beast would be overturned, the false prophet's voice would be silenced, the image of blasphemy would be destroyed, the occupation would end in a single moment, and the beast, the one who had trampled the holy city for 42 months, would not die in battle. Revelation was explicit. He would be captured alive, along with the false prophet, and thrown directly into the lake of fire. No courtroom, no appeals, no speeches, justice without delay. Elias whispered into the wind, "And the city will finally breathe again." He imagined the survivors stepping cautiously into the sunlight, hope flickering in their eyes like candles relit after the storm. He imagined families embracing. He imagined the trembling relief of those who had fled into the wilderness and now returned. He imagined streets once patrolled by oppression, now filled with music, laughter, and worship. He imagined the moment the king ascended to his throne, not a throne built by human kings, but one rooted in eternity. A throne from which Christ would rule the world for 1,000 years. And suddenly, Elias realized something profound. Everything Satan had tried to do in that city, every desecration, every occupation, every attempt to replace God's authority would be undone in an instant. The first fallen city becomes the first restored city. The most desecrated place becomes the most holy place. The center of rebellion becomes the center of righteousness. The city trampled becomes the city exalted. The city of tears becomes the city of joy. The earthly Jerusalem becomes the millennial capital of the world. Elias sat on the bench, overwhelmed. This wasn't just prophecy. This was the character of God on display. The God who restores what was broken, who heals what was wounded, who rebuilds what was shattered, who resurrects what was buried, who crowns what was cursed. He closed his eyes again, letting the vision unfold even further. Beyond the 1,000 years, beyond the final rebellion, beyond the great white throne judgment, he saw a new heaven, a new earth, a new city descending like a bride adorned for a husband, not rebuilt by human hands, not restored by human effort, not maintained by human strength, but born from the very heart of God, the New Jerusalem shining like jasper, radiant as crystal, surrounded by walls of precious stones, illuminated by the glory of God Himself. And in that city there was no temple, because the Lord and the Lamb were the temple. There was no sun, because God Himself was the light. There were no tears, because sorrow had been erased. There was no night, because darkness had been defeated forever. The first city to fall becomes the eternal city that never falls again. Elias felt tears on his cheeks. He did not wipe them away. This was the story the world needed, not fear, not confusion, not sensational speculation about Babylon's fall, but the truth that the entire arc of prophecy bends toward redemption, not destruction. He stood slowly, taking one last look at the city. Then he whispered with a trembling voice, "You will rise, higher than ever, higher than any throne ever imagined." With that, he walked back down the path, feeling lighter than he had in months. The burden was still there, but now it was a burden with purpose, a burden wrapped in hope. When he returned to the United States, Elias began writing not academic papers, not lecture notes, but a message for every believer who felt overwhelmed by news headlines, political chaos, or prophetic uncertainty. A message that said, "Do not fear the fall. Fear missing the restoration. Fear watching the wrong city. Fear listening to the wrong voices. But never fear the end, because the end is not the end. The end is the beginning of glory." He wrote late into the night, crafting words meant to awaken hearts. He recorded videos, taught online classes, and appeared on live streams. And every time he spoke, he carried the same gentle urgency that Jesus had spoken on the mountain. "Pay attention, understand, watch the city I named, and always, always," he ended with hope. Because the story does not stop at the Antichrist. The story ends with Christ, and with a city restored, a world renewed, a kingdom established, and a people redeemed forever. Before he published his final message, Elias added one last line: "Babylon burns into silence, but the first fallen city sings again." He closed his laptop, breathed deeply, and smiled. This was the story he was born to tell, and now it was time for the world to hear it. Call to action: invite readers to join faith thinkers. If this message stirred your heart, if the truth awakened something inside you, if you want deeper understanding of prophecy, scripture, hope, and the story God is writing through the ages, then I invite you to subscribe to Faith Thinkers. Faith Thinkers is where believers explore the Word with clarity, courage, and depth, where questions become discovery, where prophecy becomes hope, where faith becomes understanding. Subscribe now to Faith Thinkers and step into a community that thinks deeply, believes boldly, and follows Christ faithfully. Your journey doesn't end here, it begins here.